Let's talk about agricultural policy in the 2000s. Specifically, we're going to talk about the 2002 Farm Bill. Before we get to the 2002 Farm Bill, a little bit of background. First of all, crop insurance. Crop insurance has been around for a long time, but crop insurance is gradually morphing and changing over time as we develop new policies regarding crop insurance. And a criticism of agricultural policy popped up in the 1990s. As you will remember, when the 1996 Farm Bill really didn't do what it was intended to do, we started giving farmers direct payments using disaster relief policy in order to make these payments. And there was a big criticism, and that was that if we're going to just give out disaster relief payments, farmers are never going to buy crop insurance. So the 2000 Ag Risk Protection Act basically stepped in and it started subsidizing private reinsurance companies. Now, a reinsurance company is a company that insurance companies buy insurance from. So insurance companies don't bear the risk whenever they sell you an insurance policy. They just sell that risk to a reinsurance company. And interestingly enough, they insure themselves. And it resulted in increased funding and subsidies for crop insurance. And so in the early 2000s, we get this bump where we're going to start paying insurance companies to, in essence, write insurance policies for farmers. Now, a little bit more about the 1996 Farm Bill, because there's a lot of just fallout from that Farm Bill because it was so different from any other Farm Bill. The 1996 direct payments, the DPs they called them, were considered to be a buyout. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got to remember that farmers have been getting subsidies of some type now. Some type of policy has enhanced their income since the Great Depression. When your grandfather gets a subsidy and your father gets a subsidy and then you get a subsidy, you begin to think that you have some type of legal right to the subsidy. You begin to think of it as a thing that you own that is yours. Part of the politics of the 96 bill was to tell farmers that we're going to get rid of our crop policies. We're going to get rid of our subsidies for corn and soybeans and wheat. In the process of getting rid of it, we're going to buy you out. We're going to give you this payment, and after you receive this payment, you no longer have the right to claim that you have a right to any kind of government payment. So those direct payments were considered a buyout. That's going to be real important later, so keep that in mind. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So in comes the 2002 Farm Bill, and the direct payments of the 1996 Farm Bill were replaced by a Production Flexibility Contract Payment, a PFC payment. So farmers are still getting a direct payment in the 2002 Farm Bill, and this is a decoupled direct payment, so it's not tied to anything that the farmer is producing in the current crop year. Target price with deficiency payment returned, and it gets a new name, and now it's called the CounterCyclical Program Payments. What you've always got to remember is that it's not always politically feasible just to give someone a subsidy. If you just called it a subsidy, political fallout would be huge. So you've got to give it some kind of fancy name. And so what we started doing in 2002 is we started wording this payment as if it were a type of insurance. It's not a payment, it's a counter-cyclical program payment, meaning that you only get a payment when the price drops below some threshold to take out the low end in prices that happen to pop up from time to time. Now, if you're a critical thinker, you'll notice that that is indeed the same thing as a target price with a deficiency payment. It's just gotten a new name. Another interesting thing we see pop up that the textbook presents is the 2002 Farm Bill starts giving us these formulas that we use to calculate the payments. So for the direct payment, your payment is based on your historic production. It's based on your base. And so you get the direct payment rate. So maybe you get 25 cents per bushel. Your yield multiplied by your base acres would be your production. And you get 85% of whatever the payment rate is. So your payment is going to be the payment rate, like maybe it's 25 cents or 20 cents a bushel, multiplied by your yield, multiplied by your base acres, multiplied by 0.85. So you only get 85% of that payment, which always seemed weird to me. Why not just make the payment 15% lower? Whatever, they don't ask me to write these policies. Now, the counter-cyclical payment is a little bit tricky. It only kicks in if the market price plus your direct payment falls below a target price, or if the loan rate plus a direct payment falls below a target price. That's right, the loan rate, the non-recourse marketing loan is still there. We haven't gotten rid of this particular policy yet. And again, there's a complicated formula to determine what your countercyclical payment is. And so basically, if this formula in front of you right now happens to be a positive number, you'll get a payment. And again, it's based on 85% of your yield times your base acres and some function of the target price and the direct payment. I don't really expect you to write the formula down and memorize it. And the main thing is I kind of want you to understand that we're moving into this era where we're going to start putting these formulas up, and you've got these complicated systems for determining what the farmer is actually going to get for their subsidy. Not that the systems we had back in the 50s and 60s weren't complicated. Some sticky issues that popped up. The first one is, what's a fair way to define your base? A farmer might wake up and realize that their base was based in the 1980s, and while their yield and the amount of land they're farming may have changed dramatically since then. The other issue is, and this is something that's important that I want you to put a little asterisk by and make sure you understand, is the question of who gets the payment, the landlord or the tenant. So you might have a farmer that's been farming their own land, and therefore they have a base established. And as a result of having a base established, they're due a payment of some type. But what happens if they stop farming and they rent that land out to someone else? Should the payment go to the landlord or the tenant? Well, it was decided that the tenant, the person actually doing the farming, is the one who should get the payment. This is a farm subsidy after all, not a landowner subsidy, which is in itself problematic because of this concept of capitalization. So what is capitalization? This is something that pops up any time that farm profits increase. When farm profits increase, more people want to get into farming. Farmers want to plant more acres. That means they have to have more land. Where are they going to get the land from? Well, there's two options for getting the land. You either got to go out and buy it, or you got to go rent land. Well, if everyone's going out buying and renting extra land because they want to plant a bigger crop, that's going to bid the price of land up. So what basically ends up happening is the landlord looks at this and says, well, gee, there's this 25 cents a bushel direct payment that the farmer who rents my land is going to get. And the rational thing for them to do, if they're a profit maximizer, is to go ahead and just raise the rent by 25 cents a bushel. So if they've got, 150 bushel acre corn, they just charge, 0.25 times 150 additional rent on that piece of land, and then they basically get to extract the payment from the tenant. Now, you can't do that entirely because the tenant would walk away from that deal. But the point of this is that most of the time, whenever we subsidize agriculture or whenever there's an increase in farm prices, whatever the case may be, we end up in a situation where the extra profit that should have gone to the person farming the land ends up accruing to the person who owned the land initially. So owning land and holding on to it is really profitable, especially when these farm policies kick in and make farming more profitable. So capitalization is the process by which farm subsidies get capitalized into the price of the land. Hence, the landowner, prior to the passing of the policy, is the one who actually tends to benefit from the policy. And this capitalization process, it erodes farm profitability. Right now, there's provisions in the Farm Bill to support beginning farmers and ranchers because a lot of young people don't want to get into farming because it's not financially viable. It's too expensive to buy the land and buy the equipment and get started farming. Well, maybe the reason why it's so expensive is because of capitalization. Maybe if we didn't have almost 100 years of farm subsidies, that the land would be cheaper and someone young like yourself who wanted to get started farming might be able to afford to farm. And so that's just one of the problems with tinkering with markets, is you end up creating these problems, these unforeseen circumstances. Now, the non-recourse marketing loans were not based on the base. The non-recourse marketing loans were based on your current production. And just like before, the farmer can treat the non-recourse marketing loan as a target price with a deficiency payment and take the LDP, the loan deficiency payment, or they can do the whole complicated loan process where they borrow the money from the government, and if they don't pay the loan back, they can just forfeit the grain. In a sense, the government buys up the grain. Now, this is something that I want to take a minute to talk about and explain, and I want to rewind a little bit to the idea of a buyout that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So in October 2004, the federal government drew a line in the sand and ended the tobacco subsidy program. Prior to 2004, farmers had a legal right to grow tobacco on their land. They had an allotment, a marketing quota. And in essence, what would happen is if you grew this much tobacco, the federal government would guarantee a price for your tobacco. So in 2004, we got rid of that program. And what you have to remember that happened that's really important here is that the previous policy, before 2004, the tobacco farmer was allowed to lease their allotment to another farmer, meaning you didn't have to grow tobacco to make any money in the tobacco market. You, in essence, had a license from the federal government to grow 2,000 pounds of tobacco. And if you didn't want to farm it yourself, another farmer might say, hey, I'd like to farm it. What can I pay you for it? And a marketplace basically picked up for licenses to grow tobacco. Eventually, the policy opened up a little bit, and originally you were allowed to just trade it among county lines, and it got to the point where you could trade among state lines. So you could find another tobacco farmer anywhere in the state, and you could sell your legal right to produce and market tobacco to that farmer. So in essence, what happened is we created a marketplace for the license to grow tobacco, and that license to grow tobacco all of a sudden started having a real tangible market economic value. And now the federal government rolls in and says, we're done subsidizing tobacco, we're getting rid of it. Well, that's going to be politically infeasible because all those people who've been making money growing tobacco, buying allotment from somebody else, selling their allotment to somebody, have seen this as an income stream. They see it as an asset, and they see the federal government as taking away their asset. So we had to go in from just a political standpoint and purchase the quota from the farmers. The farmers got a check and they were told, no more tobacco subsidy for you. Grow tobacco if you want to and sell tobacco on the open market if you want. But this idea of we're going to give you an allotment that you can sell and trade, and then you can go and sell tobacco, grow tobacco and sell it at a higher subsidized price. We're done with that. We're not going to do that anymore. And so compensation was provided to tobacco producers in order to transition them out, to basically buy them out. So it was a tobacco buyout. And it's really odd to think that such a thing could happen, that you could give someone a subsidy and they would begin to view that subsidy as an asset with real market value. And then to take the subsidy away from them, you have to give them a check so that they'll, continue to vote for you. And that is the bulk of what I wanted to talk about in the early 2000s, the 2002 Farm Bill and this 2004 Tobacco Transition Payment Program. I'll catch you in the next video.